August 16th, 1951, a village in southern France. It's quiet, medieval, stone buildings older than most countries. A town of around 4,000 people on the banks of the Rhone River where, by all accounts, nothing really happens. It's 2 hours before noon, and a young farmer stumbles through the front door of Dr. Jean Vieux's office. He's babbling incoherently. He's waving his arms like something inside him is trying to claw its way out. Dr. Vieux calms him down, barely, and then a second man appears at his door. This one's worse. He's screaming that snakes are crawling through his insides. They're consuming him from the inside out. It takes 3 people over an hour to convince him that the snakes aren't real. In 5 minutes, a third man shows up. Same thing, different nightmare, and then they just keep coming. By nightfall, Dr. Vieux's office is treating 75 patients, the local hospital is full, and 22 people have to be sheltered in a barn. Nurses run out of rope to tie patients to their beds, so they start using horse harnesses. An 11-year-old boy throws his own mother to the ground and tries to strangle her. A local politician tears off his clothes and dances in the town square. An elderly man runs through the streets screaming, "My belly is full of snails. They're burning me to death." He sits down, calm now, and says, "I'm sending out radio messages everywhere. Get me an x-ray and you can see." A young man in his 20s gets so violent it takes 5 ambulance attendants to subdue him. Then they get a straitjacket on him. He rips it in half. They strap him to a cot with thick leather restraints. He chews through them even as his teeth fall out his bloody mouth. And when he breaks loose, he grabs the metal bars of his jail cell and bends them. A 12-year-old boy sprints through the town screaming that the dead are rising from the cemetery. "They're coming to eat us. They're coming to eat us alive." A 5-year-old girl looks at her mother and says, "Tigers are going to eat us all. They're going to tear us to pieces." Then she stares at the ceiling. Blood's dripping down on everything. Can't you stop the blood? Even the animals. Dogs dropping dead. Cats acting like they're out of their minds. I guess that's like how cats act. A dog sits in the town square and looks at the sun and howls for a solid hour before somebody has to come and drag him away. Now, within 48 hours, over 250 people are affected. 32 of those are committed to an insane asylum outside of Marseille. At least 7 are dead. A reporter in Paris writes this about what's happening: "It's neither Shakespeare nor Edgar Poe. It is, alas, a sad reality around Pont-Saint-Esprit, terrifying scores of hallucination, scenes straight out of the Middle Ages, full of sinister shadows. The doctors are beside themselves. The rumors are vivid and contradictory. Fear hangs over the town everywhere, and nobody knows when it'll end." So there's no war, no gas leak, no industrial accident, just cursed bread. That's the official answer anyway. A fungus on the flour at the local bakery. Case closed. The baker was blamed, and for 60 years, that's where the story ended, until the journalist spent a decade pulling classified CIA documents and found something in those files that nobody was ever supposed to see. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History, broadcasting from an undisclosed location in the great state of Vermont for ASH Season 2. This is Project Span. So the sun comes up on August 17th, and Pont-Saint-Esprit looks like a war zone. People are still hallucinating, and families are barricaded inside their homes. Kind of like the Purge. The hospital is beyond capacity, doctors from surrounding towns are being brought in by the carload, and everybody wants to know the same thing. What happened? The French authorities descend on the village almost immediately. Police, health inspectors, government scientists, they start working the case like you would expect. Water supply, food storages, anything that the affected residents may have had in common. And they find it pretty fast. Bread. Specifically bread from one bakery, Roche Briand's bakery. Briand is the town baker. He's been baking for the community for years. His shop supplies a huge portion to the village, and almost everyone who got sick ate this guy's bread on August 16th or in the days leading up to it. So the investigations zero in on Briand's flour supply. They test it, and what they find, or what they say they find, is ergot. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea. It grows on grain, especially rye, and it's been poisoning people for centuries. In the Middle Ages, they called it St. Anthony's fire. Whole villages would break out in convulsions, gangrene, madness. It was devastating. It was real. The French investigators got their answer. Briand's flour was contaminated with ergot. The bread was poisoned. Not intentionally, just bad grain slipped through. It's a tragic accident, but case closed. Briand's reputation's destroyed. The man who fed the village is now the man who poisoned it. His name becomes synonymous with the disaster. Le pain maudit, the cursed bread. That's what they call it. Not the cursed flour or the cursed grain, the cursed bread. His bread. And for 60 years, that's the answer. It's in the textbooks, the medical literature. If you look up Pont-Saint-Esprit in any reference before 2009, that's what you'll find. Ergot and the baker. Case closed. But ergot, that explanation isn't so clean. It's got problems, big problems, and they were visible almost immediately to anyone who was actually paying attention to the science. And we're going to get to those problems because once you see them, the official story actually starts to fall apart. And what's behind it is a lot darker than bad flour. Let's talk about ergot for a second. Ergot poisoning is real. It's killed people for centuries. In the Middle Ages, when infected grain got into the flour supply, entire communities would get sick. That's documented and nobody's disputing that. But ergot does specific things to the human body. And this is where that French village case starts to fall apart. Classic ergot poisoning comes in two forms. The first is gangrenous. It restricts blood flow to your extremities. Your fingers and your toes turn black. They look charred, like they've been burned. That's why they called it St. Anthony's fire. The second form is convulsive. Seizures, spasms, neurological collapse. Now, both forms share a signature symptom, an intense burning sensation in the limbs. It's so consistent across centuries of documented outbreaks that it's basically the calling card of this disease. So here's the problem. In January 1952, just months after that outbreak, a British physician named Dr. Donald Johnson traveled to Pont-Saint-Esprit and spent several days with Dr. Vieux. And Johnson noticed something that should have raised eyebrows. Dr. Vieux's report made no mention of burning sensations in the limbs. None whatsoever. Not a single patient. The defining symptom of ergot poisoning. Not there. So what was there? We've got euphoria, vivid, complex visual hallucinations, colors, shapes, animals, blood, anxiety, paranoia, delusions of persecution. One man jumped from a window because he felt enclosed and had to escape. A noted French psychiatrist named Dr. Jean Touillet studied this extensively. His conclusion? The mental illness seen in medieval ergot outbreaks didn't come from hallucinogenic property of the fungus. It came from massive doses of vasoconstricting alkaloids, and probably from the hysteria of watching your own limbs rot off. Means the vivid technicolor hallucinations of Pont-Saint-Esprit, the tigers, the snakes, the blood dripping from the ceilings, the dead raising from the cemeteries, those aren't ergot symptoms. Those are LSD symptoms. And that's not just me saying it. A September 1951 article in the British Medical Journal, published weeks after the outbreak, argued that it was caused by something other than bread ergot. Even the medical experts who did support the ergot theory had to stretch to make it work. The best they could say was the source was most likely a derivative of ergot of extremely concentrated power, able to produce bizarre and incredibly unique psychic symptoms. Got that? A derivative of ergot of extremely concentrated power that produces bizarre psychic symptoms. Want to know what LSD is? A derivative of ergot of extremely concentrated power that produces bizarre psychic symptoms. LSD is literally made from ergot alkaloids. Albert Hofmann synthesized it at Sandoz laboratories in Basel, Switzerland in 1938. And Sandoz, which is right across the border from southern France, was supplying the drug to researchers since 1947. So the best medical explanation for what happened is a derivative of ergot of extremely concentrated power, and a drug matching the exact description existed and was in active production being distributed to the government researchers at the time of the outbreak. But why did the investigation stop at the bread? So the question about the bread. Why didn't the investigators stop? Nobody picked it up. There were few researchers over the years who picked at the edges. Dr. Johnson with his hemp theory, John Fuller, a journalist who wrote a book about the outbreak in the 60s called The Day of St. Anthony's Fire. Fuller got close. He knew something didn't add up, but he couldn't crack it. There's a guy named H.P. Albarelli Jr. Albarelli was an investigative journalist. He wasn't looking for Pont-Saint-Esprit, not at first. He was investigating the death of a man named Frank Olson. We did an episode on Frank Olson. Check it out if you get a chance. But for those of you who haven't, here's what you need to know. Frank Olson was a biochemist at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He worked at a unit called the Special Operations Division, or SOD. This was the U.S. Army's top secret biological and chemical weapons lab. And SOD had a partnership with the CIA, a classified partnership. It was so secret that the scientists working on different parts of it weren't even allowed to discuss their work with each other. In November 1953, Olson was taken to a retreat at Deep Creek Lake. A CIA scientist named Sidney Gottlieb was there, and he slipped LSD into the man's drink without his knowledge. Now, days later, Olson went through the window of a hotel room on the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. The government called it a suicide. For 22 years, nobody questioned that, until 1975, when the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission started pulling back the curtain on CIA operations. And the Olson family finally learned for the first time that Frank was drugged by his own government before he died. Albarelli spent years digging into the Olson case. FOIA requests, declassified documents, interviews with former CIA and SOD personnel. Now, somewhere in that mountain of paperwork, he found something. A CIA document referencing a Special Operations Division project called SPAN, Project SPAN. It took place in 1961 in Pont-Saint-Esprit, France. That's the ergot outbreak. Same month, same village, same event. Except now it's got a project name and it's sitting in a CIA file. And that wasn't all. Albarelli found a separate document, a routing memo that was apparently generated for the Rockefeller Commission. It listed names and incidents connected to the Olson case in numbered order. And number 11 on that list has exactly 5 words. Pont-Saint-Esprit incident, Olson. That's the French village where 250 people went insane, along with the name of a dead army scientist on the same line, in the same file. It's curious. Albarelli dug deeper. He tracked down 2 former CIA sources. They're referenced in his book only as Albert and Neil, and what they told him rewrote the history of what happened at that village. According to Albert and Neil, Project SPAN was a joint operation between the Army Special Operations Division and the CIA's security branch, a pre-artichoke field experiment. And Frank Olson, whose passport confirms he was in France in the summer of '51, was there. But Olson talked. He broke security. He spoke about the French experiment to colleagues, to a neighbor he carpooled with. Now, that neighbor reported him to Camp Detrick security, and once Olson was flagged as a man who couldn't keep quiet about what happened in that French village, his days were numbered. So who was running this program? Who had the authority, the chemicals, the institutional willingness to dose an entire civilian population and then eliminate the scientists who decided to talk about it? What kind of organization has a program capable of poisoning an entire village? Well, let's look at what was running in 1951. That's the same year as Pont-Saint-Esprit. The CIA had a program called Artichoke. That's the actual cryptonym, like a code name. And we have those internal documents because some of them survived the purge. I've read them. They're sitting right here. And they're remarkable. The program's stated aims, written in their own words in a July 1953 memo to the Director of Security, to perfect techniques utilizing existing drugs, hypnosis, and other elements for the extraction of information from individuals, whether willing or not. Whether willing or not. That's a direct quote from the official CIA document. Their words. And it gets worse. The same memo lists additional objectives. The development of means for the control of the activities and mental capabilities of individuals, whether willing or not. And to provide field teams for testing, experimenting, and refining techniques utilizing currently known and recommended new materials for the extraction of information from indigenous personnel under field conditions. Field conditions. Testing on indigenous personnel under field conditions. That's not a lab experiment. That's an actual operation. Now, in April 1952, an artichoke officer wrote a research wish list. I'm not exaggerating when I call it that. It's literally a list of suggestions for special research relative to artichoke. Chemicals and drugs that can be concealed in common items such as food, water, Coca-Cola, beer, liquor, cigarettes, gases and aerosols that would be effective in artichoke work. the effects of high and low pressure on individuals, sound vibrations, monotonous sounds, ultrasonics, bacteria, plant cultures, fungi, and I'm quoting here, media capable of producing illnesses which in turn would produce high fevers and delirium. How about electroshock and a lobotomy? A hypospray device designed alongside the lines of a fountain pen, and something called a Scheintot pistol. It's a German weapon whose name literally translates to appearance of death. This is April 1952, less than a year after Pont-Saint-Esprit, and the operational documents are even worse. January 1954, an artichoke team visits a field station to evaluate a hypothetical problem. The problem is this. Can an individual be drugged through an alcoholic cocktail at a social party, subjected to artichoke techniques, and then induced to carry out an act of attempted assassination involuntarily? Sounds like a movie script, I know, but it's a real CIA document. It's got a classification stamp on it and everything. The team's answer, by the way? Probably not under those specific conditions, but under crash conditions and appropriate authority from headquarters, the artichoke team would undertake the problem in spite of the operational limitations. That means they said yes, just give us better conditions and authorization. A separate 1954 memo proposes an entire artichoke research program conducted on unwilling subjects under the guise of medical treatment. Phase 1, hypnosis on patients who don't know that they're being experimented on. Phase 2, drugs or a combination of drugs and hypnosis on a fairly large scale. And what was the ideal outcome of every artichoke operation? It's right there in the 1951 Special Comments memo. The ideal situation in regard to the use of artichoke would be to create a complete and perfect amnesia in every subject. They wanted the targets to forget it ever happened. So let's put it together. In 1951, the CIA had an active program designed to test psychochemicals on unwilling human subjects in the field. The program explicitly exploited drugs that could be hidden in food and water. The program's personnel traveled overseas in field teams. The program sought to produce amnesia in its targets, and the program was jointly operated with the Army Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, the same unit Frank Olson worked for. The same unit whose scientists' passports show that they were in France in August of 1951. The program had the means, it had the method, and the records prove that the program had the willingness. Sidney Gottlieb, born 1918, raised in the Bronx, had a club foot and a stutter his whole life, got a PhD in biochemistry from Caltech, joined the CIA in 1951. Happens to be the same year as the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident. Gottlieb ran the CIA's Technical Services Staff Chemical Division. That made him the agency's in-house expert on poisons, drugs, and anything you can put into the human body without them knowing. He's the man who turned the artichoke wish list into an operational reality, and his partner in that work was the U.S. Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick. SOD was the military's top-secret biological and chemical weapons lab. Their scientists developed anthrax and every exotic poison you've never heard of. And under a classified agreement, SOD provided the CIA with materials, delivery systems, and personnel for covert operations. Frank Olson worked at SOD, Gottlieb worked at the CIA, and together, their organization ran what would become the largest program of human experimentation in American intelligence history. In April 1953, Gottlieb convinced CIA Director Allen Dulles to approve a new umbrella program, MKUltra, 149 sub-projects across 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, pharmaceutical companies. The stated purpose was research and development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations. And the experiments ran under that umbrella were exactly what you'd expect from people who wrote memos about lobotomies and Scheintot pistols. They dosed unwitting subjects with LSD in bars, restaurants, and at dinner parties. They had prostitutes lure men to CIA safe houses in San Francisco and New York. It's an operation that they actually called Midnight Climax. No joke. The women would bring men back to those apartments, the CIA would spike their drinks with LSD, and the agents would watch through one-way mirrors. They'd take notes on how the men behaved under the influence. George Hunter White ran the San Francisco operation, former federal narcotics agent. He'd sit behind the mirror on a portable toilet drinking martinis and watching. That's not me being facetious, that's from his own diaries. In November 1953, Gottlieb's team dosed one of their own. It's a group of SOD and CIA scientists. They gathered at a retreat at Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland. Gottlieb slipped LSD into a bottle of Cointreau. Frank Olson drank it, he wasn't told, and within days, Olson spiraled. Paranoia, anxiety, he wanted out. He wanted to leave the SOD. And on November 28, 1953, Frank Olson went out the closed window of room 1018A at the Statler Hotel in New York City, 13th floor. The CIA called it a suicide. The Manhattan DA's office, decades later, called it something else. Olson knew about Project Span, and in 1973, 20 years after Olson went through that window, Sidney Gottlieb personally ordered the destruction of MKUltra files. Thousands of documents gone on the verbal orders of CIA Director Richard Helms. The files that survived by accident. Financial records that got mixed up in the wrong box. And it was in those records, the ones that they missed, that the trail back to Pont-Saint-Esprit was hiding. We have a CIA document that names a Special Operations Division project called Project Span, dated August 1951. Location, Pont-Saint-Esprit, France. We have a Rockefeller Commission memo that links the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident directly to Frank Olson. Same line, same file. We have Frank Olson's passport placing him in France in the summer of 1951, alongside multiple SOD scientists there at the same time, I might add. We have two former CIA sources telling Albarelli that Project Span was a joint operation between SOD and the CIA security branch, a pre-artichoke field experiment. We have those same sources confirming that Olson broke security by talking about the French experiment, and that's what got him flagged. We have a former Camp Dietrich scientist speaking anonymously who told Albarelli that the Pont-Saint-Esprit experiment involved the aerosol spraying of potent LSD mixtures, as well as the contamination of local food products. And one of those scientists said that the spraying had been an all-out failure. Think about that. He didn't say the experiment didn't happen. He said the spraying part failed. Other methods worked, like the food, like the bread. We have the Sandoz Laboratories representative, Sandoz being the company that manufactured LSD, who told a CIA contact that the Pont-Saint-Esprit secret is that it wasn't the bread at all. When the CIA contact asked how the material got into the people if it wasn't the bread, the Sandoz men said, "I think the whole business was an experiment." An experiment by whom? Maybe the French government, he said. Then he started talking about LSD. We have the CIA's own records showing that by February of 1953, the agency's scientists at Eli Lilly cracked Sandoz's secret formula for manufacturing LSD and were producing it in bulk. And we know from the artichoke documents that the CIA was intensely interested in ergot and lysergic acid for some time before that. We have a symptom profile at Pont-Saint-Esprit that matches LSD and does not match classic ergot poisoning. Remember, no burning sensation, no gangrene, vivid hallucinations, euphoria, paranoia, delusions. It's every signature of an acid trip. We have an institutional apparatus, artichoke, SOD, TSS, Gottlieb. They were actively developing the capability to dose unwitting populations through food, water, and aerosol delivery at the exact time that this happened. And we have the fact that the man who ran it all, Sidney Gottlieb, destroyed the files in 1973. But here's what we don't have. We don't have a signed order that says, dose the village at Pont-Saint-Esprit. That document, if it ever existed, is either classified, destroyed, or probably both. We don't have Gottlieb's confession. He never admitted to it. He died in 1999. We don't have the full Span file. We have references to it, but we don't have the file itself. And we don't have an official acknowledgement from the CIA or the US government. They've never confirmed or denied involvement. So, is it a slam dunk? Honestly, no. But I'll tell you what is. It's a mountain of circumstantial evidence built on a documentary foundation that came out of the government's own files. It's found by accident in their records that was supposed to have been destroyed. And the question that every one of these documents raises is the same question the French government should have asked in 1951. If it was just ergot, why is the CIA talking about it? It's time to wrap this up. 7 people died in Pont-Saint-Esprit, and 250 people were poisoned. 32 were committed to an insane asylum, and the man who took the blame, Roche-Briand, the town baker, lived the rest of his life as the man who poisoned his neighbors. Le Pain Maudit, the cursed bread. That's his legacy. That's how he's remembered in the history books. The baker who contaminated flour and drove a village insane. But if Albarelli's sources are right, if the documents mean what they're supposed to mean, then Briand isn't guilty of anything. He was a patsy, the longest-running patsy in Cold War history. His flour wasn't contaminated with ergot. His bread was contaminated by something else, by someone else, for reasons that had nothing to do with baking and everything to do with a classified American weapons program that was testing psychochemical agents on an unwitting civilian population. And the program that may have done this to his village didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. It got bigger. Artichoke became MKUltra. MKUltra ran for 20 years. Thousands of unwitting subjects across the United States and abroad, prisons, hospitals, universities, CIA safe houses, and the man who ran it all, Sidney Gottlieb, when it was finally over, you know what he did? He retired to a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, a place called Blackwater Homestead. No electricity, no running water. He raised goats and chickens, grew vegetables, built a sundial. He went folk dancing with his wife 4 or 5 times a week. He got a master's degree in speech therapy because he stuttered his whole life, and he spent his latter years volunteering at schools, helping people with speech problems. He worked with a hospice helping people to die. His neighbors had no idea he worked for the CIA. Seymour Hersh, the journalist who broke the My Lai massacre, visited Gottlieb during this period. Here's what he said about it. It was strange. Gottlieb was living as if he was an ashram in India. He was trying to absolve himself. If he had been Catholic, he'd have gone to a monastery. He was a destroyed man, riddled with guilt. Guilt over what exactly, though? Well, the man destroyed the files. He destroyed the evidence. He never confessed. He never stood trial. He never spent a day in prison, and then he died in 1999 at the age of 80 in his bed. The people of Pont-Saint-Esprit didn't get that luxury. They got tigers that weren't there, snakes crawling through their insides, blood dripping from the ceilings, a 5-year-old girl screaming about things that 5-year-olds should never see, and then 60 years of being told it was bread. The CIA has never confirmed or denied involvement in what happened at Pont-Saint-Esprit. The French government has never reopened its investigation, and the full span file, if it exists, remains classified. But the documents that survive tell the story, and that story don't point to ergot. It points to the same people, the same program, the same institutional machinery that dosed Frank Olson, ran Operation Midnight Climax, and built the largest covert human experimental program in American history. And if you're sitting there thinking, they wouldn't do that, they wouldn't poison an entire village just to see what would happen, then you haven't been paying attention, because the documents say they would. The documents actually say they did, over and over and over again, to soldiers, to prisoners, patients in hospitals who thought that they were getting treatment, strangers in bars that thought they were having a drink. The only question is whether they did it to Pont-Saint-Esprit, and I think the answer is probably sitting in a file cabinet somewhere at Langley, Virginia, in a folder marked Project Span that, to be honest, nobody's ever going to see. I'm John Genoa. This has been America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.